thank you everyone for joining in. It's indeed a pleasure to address this webinar. And since most people are from the Madras Bar and the Madurai Bar, I must confess that in one sense, this is a homecoming for me. I was just telling Justice Swaminathan that I owe my professional career to the Madras Bar. My guru came from here, Mr. G. Ramaswamy, former Attorney General of India. I joined him in 1991, and I have been to the Madras High Court several times with him, and later with Mr. Rajiv Dhawan when I came to, when I assisted him in several matters, both in Madras and in Madurai. I'm indeed grateful for this invitation to talk on the current status and give you a backgrounder of the Sabrimala entry of women into the Sabrimala temple issue. Though the background drop of this lecture is the legal struggle of entry, since the matter is large before a 9-judge bench, I will not make a detailed argument on its merits. I propose instead in this address to give you a brief glimpse of the road traveled by the courts in the past 7 decades on questions of faith and the Constitution. You see, what was the constitutional vision of the founders? And what was the backdrop? India is the birthplace of 4 major religions: Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism may have been born elsewhere, but have a substantial number of followers here. India is also the largest constitutional democracy in the world. The framers of the Constitution were tasked with coming up with a framework where liberal constitutionalism and religious pluralism could coexist. The discussion on the concept of secularism took place in the dying days of the Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly and the country had suffered a geographical and political partition on religious lines. You must remember that the Constituent Assembly, when it first was gathered, had members who were there representing the seats, the areas which subsequently went to Pakistan. So for the first few months of the Constituent Assembly actually played a waiting game. They did not know whether they were going to draw up a constitution for a united India, an Akhand Bharat as is now the nomenclature, or whether something else would follow. And then came partition. People, you must also remember that Dr. Ambedkar himself had been elected to the Constituent Assembly from a seat arranged for him through the Muslim League in Bengal. It was Jogendranath Mandal, who later became Law Minister of the state of Pakistan. The first Law Minister of Pakistan was a scheduled caste Hindu called Jogen Mandal, who represented the East Pakistan as it then was, and which later has become Bangladesh. He had got Dr. Ambedkar elected. Dr. Ambedkar then subsequently, when that seat went away, had to be elected from Bombay with Congress support. But that's a different story. Excuse me for a minute. So it was this kind of backdrop when in 1949.
So you can take a cup of water and come soon. No
just
problem.
1 minute. What event?
Okay, no. Yes, sir, yes, yes.
Post-partition, almost all the remaining members had to come to a common understanding of what a secular state would be. Despite this clarity in thought, the most troubling issue was the kind of secularism which was sought to be inculcated. Would secularism mean a complete separation of state from religion with no overlaps at all? Or given the Indian context, was fostering equal respect for all religions, better suited to the native Indian genius. On one side, we had this view from Mr. Loknath Mishra, the member of the Constituent Assembly from Orissa. He was one of the famous Mishra brothers, which included later Chief Justice Rangnath Mishra. Loknath Mishra's son, Pinaki Mishra, is currently a member of the Indian Parliament. And excuse me, and this is what he said. Sir, it has been repeated to our ears that ours is a secular state. I accepted the secularism in the sense that our state shall remain unconcerned with religion. And I thought that the secular state of partitioned India was the maximum of generosity of a Hindu-dominated territory for its non-Hindu population. I did not, of course, know what exactly the secularism meant and how far the state intends to cover the life and manners of our people. To my mind, life cannot be compartmentalized, and yet I reconciled myself to the new cry. On the other end of the spectrum, you had H.V. Kamath, who coincidentally came from my home district of South Canara, but was elected from Madhya Bharat. He proposed an amendment to the following effect: that after clause 1 of Article 19, the following new subclause be added. The state shall not establish, endow, or patronize any particular religion. Nothing shall, however, prevent the state from imparting spiritual training or instruction to the citizens of the Union. One of the first discussions with respect to secularism was on the wording of the preamble. Brajeshwar Prasad from Punjab wanted the term secular to be incorporated into the preamble. H.V. Kamath wanted it to begin with the phrase, "in the name of God." Neither party succeeded. Brajeshwar Prasad had stated, "Sir, this word secular has not found any place in our constitution. This is the word on which the greatest stress has been laid by our national leaders. I do submit that this word ought to be incorporated in our preamble because it will tone up the morale of the minorities and it will check the spirit of loaferism that is rampant in politics." When the amendment proposed by Mr. Kamath was on the lines of that the following be substituted for the proposed preamble: "In the name of God, we the people of India." The rationale behind such a proposal was, whatever our shortcomings, whatever the defects and errors of this constitution, let us pray that God will give us strength, courage, and wisdom to transmute our baser metal into gold through hard work, suffering, and sacrifice for India and for her people. This has been the voice of our ancient civilization, has been the voice through all these centuries, a voice distinctive, vital, and creative. And if we, the people of India, heed that voice, all will be well with us. More serious differences arose in the context of constitutional provisions with regard to the freedom of religion. A majority were in the favor of the fundamental right to the free practice of religion. This was opposed by those who were of the view that the constitution should only include a right to worship. They argued that the term practice was too wide and would allow such antisocial practices such as Devdasi, Parda, and Sati. Many members also opposed a provision that would allow religious denominations to administer institutions and own properties. Mr. K.T. Shah from Bombay was among those who found the term practice to be of a wide connotation and stated, "I am not merely content with regulating or restricting them. I should like the state also to have the power positively and absolutely to prohibit any such practice. Such practices, in my opinion, only degrade the very name of religion. Nothing has caused more the popular disfavor of some of the most well-known and most widely spread religions in the world than the association of those religions with secular activities and with excesses that are connected with those activities. Material possessions, worldly wealth, and worldly grandeur are things which have been the doom of many an established church. Many a well-known religion which has ceased to follow the original spirit or precepts of its founders has nevertheless carried on in the popular eye business, trade, and political activity of a most reprehensible character. The state in India, if it claims to be secular, if it claims to have an open mind, should have, in my opinion, a right not merely to regulate and restrict such practices, but absolutely to prohibit them. The final text, excuse me. I'm sorry, sometimes calls come on this mobile and I have to shut them off.
No, sir, no problem.
Okay. The final text of the Constitution attempted a compromise between the conflicting views. Articles 25 to 28 provide for the right to freedom of religion. Article 25 guarantees the freedom of conscience and the right to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. The word propagate, incidentally, owes itself to Madras. It owes itself to Father Jerome D'Souza, who was principal of the, I believe, the Madras Christian College, and whom Rajaji had brought on to the Constituent Assembly. Father Jerome D'Souza was also, if I may again make that claim, from Dakshina Kannada, which was once a part of the Madras Presidency. You will notice that I will continually keep making claims on behalf of my home district, Dakshina Kannada, and you must excuse that slight amount of parochialism there. The rights under Article 25 is, however, made subject to public order, morality, and health. Significantly, it is also subject to the other provisions of the Fundamental Rights chapter. The provision also allows the state to regulate economic, financial, political, or other secular activity associated with religious practice and to provide for social welfare and reform or the throwing open of Hindu religious institutions of a public character to all classes and sections of Hindus. Article 26 allows every religious denomination or any of its sections to establish and maintain institutions for religious and charitable purposes, B, to manage its own affairs in matters of religion, C, to own and acquire movable and immovable property, and D, to administer such property in accordance with law. This too is subject to public order, morality, and health. And Article 27, no person shall be compelled to pay any taxes that are specifically appropriated in payment of expenses for the promotion or maintenance of any particular religion or religious denomination. And under Article 28, no religious instruction shall be provided in any educational institution wholly maintained out of state funds. According to Professor Faizan Mustafa of the Nalsar in Hyderabad, India as a secular state is based on three principles. The principle of equality, which demands that the state was to give no preference to one religion over the other. The principle of neutrality, that requires that the state was not to interfere in religious affairs or organizations of religious communities. The principle of liberty required that the state was to permit practice of any religion within the limits set by certain other basic rights that were to be protected by the state. Unlike in the West, secularism in India was not designed to create a wall of separation between church and state. It was shaped to assure the minorities that their culture, religion, and identity would be protected. It was also designed to tell the people at large, including the majorities, that religious affairs were to be largely governed by adherents of the religion, but nevertheless, there would be constitutional values which would have to be harmonized. The constitutional provisions with regard to religion go beyond mere state neutrality. They also seek to protect the rights, practices, and culture of adherents of religion. Now, once the constitution came in, it became the Indian judiciary's interactions with religion, which then came into question. The deliberations in the Constituent Assembly left numerous issues unresolved. These in turn were passed on to the courts. What were judges to do with these questions? What traditions were they expected to examine in order to determine whether any particular practice constituted religion? Now, let me start here with when we come down to courts, with a story from my hometown of Udupi in South Canara district. In the Udupi temple, you know that contrary to most Hindu tradition where the idol faces east, the Udupi Sri Krishna faces west. And why is that? The story goes that in the 16th century, when the Brahmins of Udupi prevented a lower caste devotee, Kanakadasa, from entering the temple, he began composing and singing kirtans from the courtyard outside. He sang about how all human beings being equal, as everyone is born the same way physically, everybody shares the same water and sees the same sun helping life on the earth. And he went on with kirtans, with prayer, with worship, from outside the temple to the idol which he could not have darshan. The story he goes that one night the idol itself turned westward, broke open in the back door, the back wall, opened a window through which he could have darshan. That window exists even today. It is called the Kanakana Kindi. And if you ever come to my hometown, Udupi, and you go to the temple, the first darshan you get is through the Kanakana Kindi. And so I am using that very metaphor to give you the kind of vision that the courts have examined these questions of religion through a Kanakana Kindi of the Constitution. The Constitution has sought to bring in certain values of equality, which may not necessarily be totally prevalent in religious practice everywhere. And it is from Udupi again that the first great religious case under the new constitution comes. It is the 1954 case of the Commissioner, Hindu Religious Endowments Madras versus Lakshmindra Tirtha Swamiyar of Shirur Mutt, this is popularly known as the Shirur Mutt case. The Shirur Mutt is one of the 8 mutts in the Udupi temple town. Each of them, for a period of 2 years, takes control of religious affairs in that town. So the Shirur Mutt came to court, first to the Madras High Court and then to the Supreme Court. Under the Madras Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act of 51, the commissioner was empowered to frame and settle a scheme if he had reason to believe that a religious institution was mismanaging its funds. When the commissioner exercised this power over the Shirur Mutt, its Mathadipati challenged this interference as being violative of the Mutt's religious freedom under Articles 25 and 26 of the Constitution. Before proceeding into the merits of the matter, the court formulated the central question before it does. The other thing that remains to be considered in regard to Article 26 is what is the scope of Clause B of the article, which speaks of the management within courts of its own affairs in matters of religion, close quotes. The language undoubtedly suggests that there could be other affairs of a religious denomination or a section thereof, which are not matters of religion, and to which the guarantee given by this clause would not apply. The question is, where is the line to be drawn between what are matters of religion and what are not? The court noted that the word religion has not been defined in the Constitution, and it is a term which is hardly susceptible of any rigid definition. It rejected the definition of religion as given by the US Supreme Court at that time and followed the one given by the Australian High Court in Adelaide Company versus Commonwealth to hold that the freedom of religion protected religious belief as well as acts done in furtherance of that belief. Critically, the court went on to hold what constitutes the essential part of a religion is primarily to be ascertained with reference to the doctrines of that religion itself. If the tenets of any religious sect of the Hindus prescribe that offerings of food should be given to the idol at particular hours of the day, that periodical ceremonies be performed in a certain way at certain periods of the year, or that there should be daily recital of the sacred texts or oblations to the sacred fire, all these would be regarded as parts of religion. And the mere fact that they involve expenditure of money or employment of priests and servants to the use of marketable commodities would not make them secular activities partaking of a commercial or economic character. Ever thereafter, the judgment of the Shirur Mutt has remained the focal point of constitutional discussions on religious freedom. The essential religious practice test, which was formulated in the Shirur Mutt case, appeased traditionalists by assuring them that the court would be sympathetic to their respective religious faiths. It also supported state-sponsored reform by leaving one agency of state, the judiciary, with the power to determine and pronounce upon and perhaps transform religious practice and belief. Since it was first propounded, the essential religious practice test has been problematic. How is a court to determine what an essential practice is? Should it rely on religious leaders? Should it call for evidence? Should judges pursue these questions on the basis of their own research? 3 years later, the Supreme Court had to, in 1957, the Supreme Court had to refine its argument in another case, also arising from the Dakshina Kannada district, from a place called Mulki. In Venkatramana Devaru versus State of Mysore, the Supreme Court examined verses from the Upanishads and the Agamas to ascertain whether exclusion of a person from entering into a temple for worship is a matter of religion according to Hindu ceremonial law. The court notes there has been a difference of opinion among the writers as to whether image worship has a place in the religion of the Hindus as revealed in the Vedas. On the other hand, we have hymns in praise of gods, and on the one hand, we have hymns in praise of gods, and on the other, we have highly philosophical passages in the Upanishads describing the Supreme Being as being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, and transcending all names and forms. When we come to the Puranas, we find a marked change. According to the Agamas, an image becomes defiled if any departure or violation of any of the rules relating to worship and purificatory ceremonies known as samprokshana have to be performed for restoring the sanctity of the shrine. The court then went on to strike a compromise. It held the right of a denomination to wholly exclude members of the public from worshipping in a temple, though comprised in Article 26b, must yield to the overriding right declared by Article 25b in favor of the public to enter into a temple for worship. But where the right claim is not of general and total exclusion of the public from worship in the temple at all times, but of exclusion from certain religious services, they being limited by rules of foundation to members of the denomination, then the question is not whether 25b overrides that right so as to extinguish it, but whether it is possible to so regulate the rights of persons protected by Article 25b as to give effect to both the rights. If the denominational rights are such that to give effect to them would substantially reduce the rights conferred by Article 25b, then of course, in our conclusion, that Article 25b prevails against Article 26b, the denominational rights must vanish. But where that is not the position, and after giving effect to the rights of the denomination, what is left to the public of the right of worship is something substantial and not merely the husk of it. There is no reason why we should not so construe Article 25B as to give effect to Article 26B and recognize the rights of the denomination in matters which are strictly denominational, leaving the rights of the public in other respects unaffected. So, if you look at the facts of the case, the God Saraswat Brahmins of the Venkatramana temple said that we have a specific right to worship the deity at particular points of time according to the rights of the GSB community. And that they could exclude all others. So what the court did was a balancing act and said that since the public had a right to enter the temple and worship, that substantial right of the public did not vanish because at certain points of time only was there an exclusion for members of the GSB community alone. And to that limited extent, both rights could be balanced and both rights could be given effect to. And this is where, again, the court does this balancing act of saying, this is essential, this is not so essential. The essentiality is temple entry and worship, which is open to everyone. It is not essential in one sense if at some points of time only some people are permitted to do some rites only. After these two big cases, which dealt with the Hindu community, the next big case comes from Islam, which is the 1959 case of Muhammad Hanif Qureshi versus the state of Bihar concerning cow slaughter. The court cited verses from the Vedas, the Ramayana, Kautilya's Arthashastra to hold that the Hindus hold the cow in great reverence. The argument that cow slaughter may be a religious practice for Muslims was referred to as a bald allegation. After a brief reference to the Quran and Hamilton's translation of the Hidayah, the court dismissed the argument that cow slaughter on Bakri Eid was an essential religious practice on the ground that the Quran, by giving an option of the slaughter of a goat for one person or a cow or camel for seven, did not compulsorily oblige the Muslim to only slaughter a cow. The court holds, it is the duty of every free Muslim arriving at the age of maturity to offer a sacrifice on the Eid Qurban or the festival of sacrifice, provided that he be possessed of nisab and be not a traveler. The sacrifice established for one person is a goat, and that for seven, a cow or a camel. It is therefore optional for a Muslim to sacrifice a goat for one person or a cow or camel for seven persons. It does not appear to be obligatory that a person must sacrifice a cow. The very fact of an option seems to run counter to the notion of an obligatory duty. It is, however, pointed out that a person with 6 other members of his family may afford to sacrifice a cow, but may not be able to sacrifice 7 goats. So there may be an economic compulsion, though there is no religious compulsion. After this kind of balancing exercise in Hanif Qureshi, in a couple of years later, in 1961, while dealing with an act regulating the Dargah Sharif in Ajmer, the court cautioned, even practices, though religious, may have sprung from merely superstitious belief and may in that sense be extraneous and unessential accretions to religious itself. Unless such practices are found to constitute an essential and integral part of a religion, their claim for their protection under Article 26 may have to be carefully scrutinized. In other words, the protection must be confined to such religious practices as are an integral part of it and no other. The court then went on to uphold the act of legislature that provided for management of the dargah and a sharing of its offerings in accordance with the act between the various khadims and religious functionaries mentioned therein. In the 80s, in Acharya Jagdishwarananda Avduta, the Supreme Court was called upon to consider whether the performance of a Tandava dance is a religious rite or a practice essential to the tenets of the religious faith of the Ananda Margis. The court answered the question in the negative, holding that though the Ananda Margi faith had come into existence in 1955, the Tandava dance was adopted only in 1966. Since the faith had existed without the practice at one point, the dance could not ever be accepted as an essential feature of its faith. The court holds, we have already indicated that the Tandava dance was not accepted as an essential religious rite of the Ananda Margis when in 1955 the Ananda order was first established. It is the specific case of the petitioner that Sri Ananda Murthy introduced the Tandava as a part of the religious rites of the Ananda Margis later in 1966. Ananda Marg as a religious order is of recent origin, and the Tandava dance as a part of the religious rites of that order is still more recent. It is doubtful as to whether in such circumstances, Tandava dance can be taken as an essential religious rite of the Ananda Margis. High courts have also followed a similar confused approach. In the Kerala High Court, in Mohammed Fasi versus State of Superintendent of Police, the petitioner, a devout Muslim, sought to grow a beard as, according to him, shaving the face is opposed to the Quranic injunctions and the Islamic religion. Instead of looking at sources of Islamic law on the essentiality of beards in Islam, the Kerala High Court based its opinion on the irrelevant fact that certain Muslim dignitaries did not have beards and that the petitioner himself had not sported a beard in previous years. Therefore, the court relied on unscientifically gathered anecdotal evidence of practice rather than of religious texts. The Kerala High Court held the court can judge the existence or otherwise of a religious practice. Common experience shows that such a practice is not in vogue. The president of a neighboring theocratic Islamic republic does not wear a beard. Similarly, high dignitaries like president, vice president, judges of the Supreme Court and High Court, and ministers have not been wearing beards. It's also not disputed that the petitioner himself had no beard since his entry into the service in the year 1963 until he submitted his representation in 1981 for permission to grow a beard as a religious requirement enjoined by the Quran and the words of the Prophet. More recently, the Bombay High Court used the essentiality test to hold that the capture and worshipping of a live cobra during Nag Panchami was not essential to the religious beliefs of the residents of the village of Bati Shirala. In that case, the petitioners had relied on the text of Srinath Leelamrut, a local religious text that prescribes the practice. The court, however, relied on a scholarly history of the Dharma Shastras, which are general religious texts of the Hindus. Based on a scholar's treatment of the text, the court held that the act could not have been an essential religious practice of the petitioner's religion. The court has held essential part of a religion means the core beliefs upon which a religion is founded. Essential practice means those practices that are fundamental to follow a religious belief. It is upon the cornerstone of essential parts of practices that the superstructure of a religion is built, without which a religion will be no religion. The test to determine whether a part or a practice is essential to a religion is to find out whether the nature of the religion will be changed without that part or practice. I would now move on to dealing with the fundamental rights and the personal law exemption which courts have been dealing with. The second question that courts have been vexed with is that faith-based personal laws that are applied to individual followers of a religion. You see, so far I dealt with questions of temple entry and Tandava, Bakri, all which deal with the practice of religion in the communal sense, as a community. But you also practice religion in your personal lives, and to what extent does the Constitution intrude there if your personal law has certain precepts which may run afoul of constitutional provisions. Excuse me for a minute.
Yes, sir.
Article 13 of the Constitution declares that all laws in force that contradict fundamental rights are null and void. In 1951, the constitutional validity of the Bombay Prevention of Hindu Bigamous Act, Marriages Act 1946 was considered by a division bench of the Bombay High Court of Justices Chagla and Gajendra Gadkar. It was contended that a provision of personal law which permits polygamy violates the guarantee of non-discrimination under Articles 14 and 15. And hence, such a practice would become void under Article 13 after the Constitution came into force. The question before the Bombay High Court was whether personal laws were included in the expression all laws in force. The bench of Justices Chagla and Gajendra Gadkar unanimously held that they were not. Thus, personal laws would not be void even if they conflict with fundamental rights. The bench holds that although the point urged before us is not by any means free from difficulty, on the whole, after a careful consideration of the various provisions of the Constitution, we have come to the conclusion that personal law is not included in the expression laws in force used in Article 13(1). It interpreted the intention of the Constitution makers thus. Yet, they did not wish that the provisions of the personal laws should be challenged by reason of the fundamental rights guaranteed in Part 3 of the Constitution, and so they did not intend to include these personal laws within that definition. The position in Narsoppa Mali's case has never seriously been challenged thereafter and has had the effect of creating islands of personal law free from constitutional norms of equality, non-discrimination, and liberty. This was the case till the recent judgment in the Triple Talaq, where the Supreme Court has held that has not yet overruled Narsoppa Mali. Some of the judges have expressed doubt, but they have left it to stand as such. And this kind of approach of hands-off approach with respect to personal law also ties in with what a lot of the Muslim leaders who belong to the Jamaat-e-Islami Hind advocate. And you must remember that the Jamaat-e-Islami Hind was totally anti-Pakistan. They said that the Constitution of India was a compact, was a contract between the remaining Muslims and the people of India at large, where personal law would be kept out of constitutional law, and the Indian Muslims could thereby negate the argument of the two states theory that Muslims could not necessarily live under a secular domination where they were not in a majority. So there is a lot of political thought also which seems to come or lend support to the Narsoppa Mali theory, which has though been doubted at times, but it has never seriously been challenged. So reverting here, customs, usages, and personal law have a significant impact on civil status of individuals. Those activities that are inherently connected with the civil status of individuals cannot be granted constitutional immunity merely because they may have some associational features which have a religious nature. To immunize them from constitutional scrutiny is to deny the primacy of the Constitution. Justice Nariman's opinion in Shaira Banu and Justice D.Y. Chandrachud's opinion in the original Sabrimala judgment have indicated that the judgment in Narsoppa Mali may be soon relooked. In Shaira Banu, Justice Nariman has held it is unnecessary for us to decide whether the judgment in Narsuppa Mali is good law. However, in a suitable case, it may be necessary to have a relook at this judgment in the definition of law and laws in force are both inclusive definition, and that at least one part of the judgment of Justice Gajendra Gadkar at para 26, in which the learned judge opines that the expression law cannot be read into the expression laws in force in Article 13.3, is in itself no longer good law. Justice Chandrachud in the original Sabrimala judgment held that the rationale adopted by Justice Chandrachud in Narsu for excluding custom usage from laws in force is unsustainable both doctrinally and from the perspective of the precedent of this court. The Supreme Court's jurisprudence on issues of religion has been characterized by two intertwined methodologies. First, its reliance on the essential religious practices test, which is essentially an exercise in judges of a constitutional court engaging in theological analysis. Secondly, it's a refusal to subject personal law to constitutional scrutiny, which is essentially an exercise of judges of a constitutional court refusing to engage with the Constitution. It needs no saying that this is problematic. Refusal to test personal laws on the touchstone of fundamental rights means that the validity of religious laws will continue to be decided on a judge's interpretation of religious texts. Thus, questions like the entry of women into mosques and dargahs or the entry of women into agyaris will be decided on the basis of religion and not the constitutional principles of equality and non-discrimination, which our republic holds dear. Secondly, it leads to an anomalous situation in as much as personal law, when codified, is amenable to fundamental rights infringement challenge. Thus, triple talaq, which was included in the Shariat Act, was struck down. However, if triple talaq had been in an uncodified form, it may have been immune to constitutional scrutiny. It is in this legal background that we need to examine the controversy over barriers of the entry of women of menstrual age into the Sabrimala shrine. The relevant rule is Rule 3B of the Kerala Hindu Places of Public Worship Authorization of Entry Rules of 1965. The relevant rule, which is the bone of contention, reads thus: the classes of persons mentioned hereunder shall not be entitled to offer worship in any place of public worship or bathe in or use the water of any sacred tank, well, spring or watercourse appurtenant to a place of public worship, whether situate or outside precincts thereof, or any sacred place, including a hill or hillock or a road, street, pathways, which is requisite for obtaining access to the place of public worship. And clause B says, women at such time during which they are not by custom or usage allowed to enter a place of public worship. The bar against women was rooted in ancient tradition and belief, but it can hardly be argued that preventing entry of women into a temple is part of the essential religious belief of the Hindu faith as a whole. It was sought to be argued that the devotees of Sabrimala constituted a separate denomination which could exclude others at certain times in their lives. It was also argued that the deity in Sabrimala as a brahmachari could exclude women of menstrual age from his worship. The court, however, in 2018, held that the prohibition against entry rested on a rule made by the Kerala government under the Religious Endowments Act. The man-made rule could and was struck down by a 4-1 judgment with which Justice Indu Malhotra dissented. The judgment held in pertinent part that the exclusionary practice being followed at the Sabrimala temple cannot be designated as one the non-observance of which will change or alter the nature of Hindu religion. Besides, the exclusionary practice has not been observed with unhindered continuity, as the Devaswam board has accepted before the High Court that female worshippers of the age group of 10 to 50 years used to visit the temple and conducted pujas in every month for 5 days for the first rice feeding ceremony of their children. The exclusionary practice, which has been given the backing of a subordinate legislation in the form of Rule 3B of the 65 Rules, framed by virtue of the 1965 Act, is neither an essential nor an integral part of the religion. Not satisfied with the Constitution bench, several, I'm sorry, just 1 minute, please.
Yes, sir.
Just a minute. Sorry.
Yes. No issues.
Okay. Sorry. Not satisfied with the Constitution bench, several review petitions were filed. On November 14th, 2019, I'm sorry that the video is slightly askew. I'll continue with my lecture. I'll just get back.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
A majority of 5 judges of the Supreme Court passed a Bezaire order. The majority, the ex-Chief Justice Gogoi, Justice Khanwilkar, and Justice Indu Malhotra seemed to notice that there was a conflict in judicial opinion regarding the extent to which courts could interfere in matters of faith. It also noted that 3 other cases relating to the validity of religious practices were pending before the court. They related to the entry of Muslim women into dargahs and mosques, entry of Parsi women married to a non-Parsi in agyaris, that's fire temples, the practice of female genital mutilation in the Dawoodi Bohra community. The majority held that in view of the conflict between the earlier pronouncements on the subject, it was possible that a larger bench would have to be constituted to adjudicate on the aforesaid issues. In this light, the majority kept the Sabrimala review petitions pending till such time as a future bench of 7 or more judges took a final view regarding the extent of the court's role in matters of religion. The bench also formulated 7 possible issues that a future bench could have dealt with. Justice Nariman and Justice Chandrachud, in my view, correctly dissented from this view. They held that what a future constitution bench, if ever formed, may or may not do was not relevant to the adjudication of the review petition. The petition seeking review had to be decided strictly in accordance with well-set parameters of review. Since none of the grounds for review had been made out, they held that the petitions were liable to be dismissed. Incorrect though the majority view in the Sabrimala review is, the petitions revived the debate about judicial interference into matters of faith. Over the years, religion has provided courts with numerous awkward issues. Are followers of Sant Kabir Hindus? Can the government celebrate the 2500th year of Lord Mahavira, the founder of Jainism? How many kirpans can a Sikh wear? Was the prevention of cow slaughter just a Hindu attempt to deprive Muslim butchers of their livelihood, or also an interference with an essential practice? The review, which the 5-judge bench kept pending for a 7-judge bench, then mysteriously has morphed now into a 9-judge bench, which was formed and which was to have heard this matter and has been delayed by the pandemic. The 9-judge review bench has proposed to hear the following questions. The issues are: what is the scope and right of freedom of religion under Article 25 of the Constitution? What is the interplay between the rights of persons under Article 25 of the Constitution and the rights of religious denominations under Article 26 of the Constitution? Whether the rights of a religious denomination under Article 26 of the Constitution are subject to other provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution apart from public order, morality, and health. Fourth, what is the scope and extent of the word morality under Articles 25 and 26 of the Constitution, and whether it is meant to include constitutional morality. 5. What is the scope and extent of judicial review with regard to a religious practice as referred to in Article 25 of the Constitution of India? 6. What is the expression sections of Hindus occurring in Article 25, 2b of the Constitution of India? And 7. Whether a person not belonging to a religious denomination or religious group can question a practice of that religious denomination or religious group by filing a PIL. At the risk of repetition, the majority judgment in the Sabrimala petitions may be flawed. It, however, presents us with an opportunity to move towards a religious jurisprudence which is firmly entrenched in the Constitution. Justice D.Y. Chandrachud recognizes this problem in the main Sabrimala judgment. He says, compulsions nonetheless have led the court to don a theological mantle. The inquiry has moved from what is essentially religious to what is an essential religious practice. Donning such a role is not an easy task when the court is called upon to decide whether a practice does or does not form an essential practice part of religious belief. Scriptures and customs merge with bewildering complexity into superstition and dogma. Separating the grain from the chaff involves a complex adjudicatory function. Decisions of the court have attempted to bring in a measure of objectivity by holding that the court has been called upon to decide on the basis of tenets of the religion itself. But even that is not a consistent norm. But Justice Nariman, in the review judgment, seeks to answer the theological question through an inquiry by another holy book, the Constitution of India. He says, after all, in India's tryst with destiny, we have chosen to be wedded to the rule of law as laid down by the Constitution of India. Let every person remember that the holy book is the Constitution of India, and it is with this book in hand that the citizens of India march together as a nation so that they may move forward in all spheres of human endeavor to achieve the great goals set out by this Magna Carta or Great Charter of India. The good book, the Holy Constitution, has words of comfort for everyone. In a secular country, being increasingly riven by religious divisions, it is a time that the deities on Bhagwan Das Road, where the Supreme Court is situated, speak clearly to the country and its coming generation of citizens. Can we as a country adhere to a non-religious holy book interpreted by men and women in black robes, or will fine theological distinctions drawn through ancient scriptures once again prevail to drag us back to a seemingly glorious past? 70 years of constitutional life so far must have given India evidence of what the better path is. What do you think, ladies and gentlemen? It is in your willing adherence to the Constitution that its legitimacy lies. I thank you for a very patient hearing. I do not know whether we have enough time to take questions. I would be willing to take a few questions, but somebody would have to moderate them.
Sir, more than 230 people are here, and 100 people have got questions. But what I suggest, let them send the questions to me either by email or WhatsApp. So I'll just compile them and send across the same to you either through Nitin or yourself. And later you may answer, sir, by seeing the questions one by one. Is it okay to you, sir?
Are you saying that on a different seminar or on this seminar itself?
Different seminar, because 102 people are waiting for asking question. So it may not be so easy to moderate and ask them one by one. And if you unmute the mic, it will be highly echoing. So instead of choosing very few people, that is what we have been doing on past. Compiling questions and sending to the speaker and inviting answers. It's left to your discretion, sir. It is up to you, absolutely your choice.
No, often questions clarify the situation. a few questions may be welcome, but
Shall I open the questions, sir, to the public audience right now?
yes, please.
Yes.
And whoever you permit to question, please let him introduce himself.
Yes, sir. I
Or
think
herself.
I'll ask people if they raise a question or hands.
Yeah.
Yes. Mr. Shekhar, you have any question? You can ask now. Everybody will Shekhar.
Not question. I just
Yeah.
hello.
Yes,
Tell me,
yes,
sir.
Mr. Shekhar, please go on.
Recognize, I am very happy that we have heard a very good lecture from you, and I have met you in Madurai when you
Yes.
accompanied this senior counsel, Mr. Rajiv Dhawan,
Yes,
and I'm your junior. Nitin is also my neighbor.
yes.
And for information, there is a long custom in Madurai Meenakshi Amman temple that live fox was brought to the temple festival from time immemorial. Thiruvadayalal Puranam. Naridhanai Pariyakuda. Now, now it's for the past 2 years, it has been changed. Though it is a customary practice for a long time, that a live fox was brought to the temple. Now a gold fox was made and it is brought to the temple festival.
Yes.
Just for information, I am telling.
Yes. Thank you. I mean, if ever that custom would be challenged.
And no, not challenged. It was not challenged. I think it was not challenged.
Okay. That is exactly the question of what is an essential religious practice.
Yes.
That's a very good illustration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else who want to pose questions, Mr. Hegde? You can raise your hands so that I can unmute yourself. Anybody else? I think we have to raise your hands so that I can identify the people and ask Mr. Hegde to answer the questions. Any questions, sir? I think Mr. Hegde, sir, I think I can collect all the questions later and send it to you so that I can go for. I think Mr. Anand Venkatesh J wants to ask a question to you. Please, sir, just a minute. Hold on the line.
Yes.
This is Anand Venkatesh is a sitting judge of the Madras High Court, and I think he wants to ask questions to you. So, NAG, please, sir,
good morning, sir.
Good morning, Judge. I can't see you, but my phone is giving problems. Please go ahead.
It's when you are able to hear me.
Yes, I am able to hear you.
It was great hearing to your talk, sir. And,
thank you.
There's only one thing which I wanted to clarify or seek your clarification. What happens where there is a clash as between two fundamental rights, which normally was focused here as between 25(1) and 25(b), as you must be knowing, that was
that
was 25(1) was with regard to the right of a woman to worship, and 25(d) is the right of the denomination to manage its own affairs. So, how to reconcile such clashes that happen as between two fundamental rights?
The first, what the court did in Venkatramana Devaru is an example where they tried to give effect to both as much as they could. So there the God Saraswat Brahmin said that, look, this is a denominational temple for God Saraswat Brahmins. We can exclude anyone if we want. The court said no. There is a unfettered right of public entry. That entry is is the greater right. It will prevail. However, if there are certain provision, certain pujas which are peculiar to the temple and its founders, and at very certain times only. So therefore, to give a better illustration, any Hindu can get into a temple and worship the deity, but can he necessarily claim a right to go right into the sanctum sanctorum and touch the deity.
Yes.
So, therefore, to at least to that extent, that the exclusion from those rights can be given effect to when there is documentation and evidence that that was how the practice was, and that it does not necessarily it is not a measure of maybe a caste or other exclusion, because you also have to deal with questions of untouchability.
Yes.
And the right of the hitherto
Article 17.
untouchables for temple entry. So temple entry is a given, but the continuing existence of the deity according to pre-existing custom, which does not necessarily conflict with the right of temple entry, can be given effect to. It's a delicate balancing act, often on the facts of a case.
My next question is, see, these are issues which are dealt with by way of repetitions filed before the court. Essential religious practices may involve or will involve taking of evidence in order to understand what that essential religious practice is. Can a court really go into that exercise while exercising a writ jurisdiction?
Well, I have indicated that in my lecture also. The court seems to have gone on, I mean, courts have gone on the basis of their own reading of the scriptures. They have read, of course, they read the file, whatever is filed before them. Specific evidence on a long standing religious practice may not necessarily be there, because it would be limited by people's lifetimes. You may at best have a 90-year-old man who can get into a thing, into the box, as it were. What other evidence can there be? Because all other evidence will be documentary. So I doubt that there would be anything in terms of religious practice which would require an actual person to step into the box. Most of it would be documentary evidence, and that the courts have weighed. In fact, even in Ayodhya, they've gone by whatever travelers' accounts or whatever is been recorded in various gazetteers.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Lordship. And one Mr. Ganesh Raj is waiting for your question, sir. Please, sir. Ganesh Raj, you can ask the question.
Ganesh.
Mr. Ganesh?
Yes, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes,
you're audible. You can ask the question.
Sir, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So my question is, so far haven't answered whether the customs, usage and personal laws will come under Article 13. I mean, the definition of law or not. So without answering that, how can they apply Part 3 of the Constitution to customs and usage?
Well, so far they have kept it out. Everybody has followed Narsua Pamali to the extent that it can be followed. As I indicated to you, Justice Chandrachud, Justice Nariman have already expressed doubts. Wherever that custom or usage has fructified into law or has been protected by a law, like triple talaq was protected by the Shariat Act, then wherever it has been legislated, courts have got it. At some stage or the other, they will have to rule that customary customs and usages in personal law do come under the ambit of the fundamental rights. That declaration is a matter of time, I believe. I don't know when that will happen.
Okay, sir. So if it happens, won't it open the Pandora box?
Well, it's a way of looking at it. It could be seen as a Pandora's box, but on the other hand, if every custom or belief of a multi-religious society still has to yield to one standard, that is the constitution, isn't that a better thing?
Absolutely.
The
Absolutely.
process will take longer. If your holy book is the constitution, then you say, fine, that is the dominant law. Everything else has to yield, including personal law.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ganesh. You can unmute your mic now. I'll just to next advocate. Advocate Mayappan, sir, is ready to ask a question to you. Mr. Mayappan.
Honorable judges, respected speaker, and learned friends. Since I'm just formulating my question, I would like to disclaim or apologize in advance if slightly wrong. Since we brought up this Muhammad versus state of Bihar regarding the cow slaughter on Bakrid and the essentiality of that practice, the issue right now is, like, I would like to draw an analogy to Article 48, the Organization of Agriculture and Animal Husbandry. There, the prohibition of the slaughter of cows and calves and other milk and raw cattle, it was prohibited with the interest to protect agriculture. It was in that sense. But then it has been, the very text of the Constitution has been misused by political interests to attack the very spirit of our Constitution. And this is a concern. How do we address these issues where the text of this Constitution has been read out of context and it attacks the spirit of the Constitution? Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of constitutional history with regard to cow slaughter and Muhammad Hanif Qureshi, and subsequently the Justice Lahoti's judgment in the Mirzapur Kasab case. The point is that right in the Constituent Assembly itself, many of the Muslim members said, please speak freely on and clearly in the Constitution. If you want to ban cow slaughter, ban it. We should know where we stand. There were, in fact, people who wanted to give cows a fundamental right to exist. The assembly said no, fundamental rights are for humans. There were several compromises which were brought in the Constitution, which especially even the drafting committee did not necessarily object to, but they said that these things have to be, might as well live with. That is why, in a very guarded sense, in the sense of the cow being an economic asset which needed to be protected, it was brought there in the directive principles. Now, that compromise was achieved in the face of objections by members of the Constituent Assembly, including Pandit Thakurdas Bhargava, who was a tax lawyer and a member of the Constituent Assembly. When the matter came up before the Supreme Court in Hanif Qureshi's case, Thakurdas Bhargava became amicus curiae, and he assisted the court. And so from the original compromise in the Constitution, there came to be a further step forward that you could ban and slaughter of most bovine creatures except some which had passed their economic utility. Thereafter, you had during the emergency the fundamental duties coming in. Then came the re-examination by Justice Lahoti's bench, which overruled Qureshi. There has been a constant inroad into the question of cow slaughter. Now, I am what shall I say? I'm agnostic on the cow slaughter question. Those who want to eat it can eat it. Those who don't want to eat it, don't eat it. If you want to worship it, do what you want. But my basic concern is that cow slaughter should not lead to human slaughter. That's a very big problem these days. Did the courts get it right, or did the courts go with their personal inclinations? I must share with you that at that another bench, a smaller bench, doubted Justice Lahoti's judgment, and they said that the larger bench consisted of only one non-vegetarian. So this is a vexed issue. I hope that if the politicians don't set it right, at some stage the judiciary again takes a relook.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions by any other members of the conference, please? Can you raise your hands here? Means I can connect to Mr. Agde. You just press the button in the option box, raise your hands. Any questions? Or shall we just wind up and wait? If any questions you want to ask, you can send it to WhatsApp. I can ask Mr. Agde to reply by either by email or any other mode. Is it okay, sir?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
So I think shall we wind up, sir?
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
So it was our pleasure, and I should thank that one of the very what is called illustrious and very academically a brilliant session. I should wholeheartedly thank you on behalf of myself and Hemalata and the members of the webinar. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Goodbye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.